Hi, my name is Tim PODELL, and I'm in Great Hills Park in Austin, Texas, about to meet Louis Sachar. Now, Louis Sachar is a wonderful writer, best known for his Newbery Award-winning book, Holes. And this will be a fantastic interview. There are a couple of things you have to know, though. If I look a little muddy, if Louis looks a little muddy, it's well because we have these dogs involved in the shoot, and you'll find out all about that and a lot more when we have a good conversation with Louis Sachar. I'm sitting here in Louis Sachar's backyard in Austin, Texas, and what do you say you answer some questions for me?
Sure.
Did you ever expect, after your many varied careers and your many very interests in college, that you'd actually grow up and be a writer?
I always liked writing. I took creative writing classes in high school, but I never really thought about children's books at all. It never even entered my mind until I worked at that elementary school while going to college. And then I thought I'll try to write one children's book and then write other types. But it was very successful and I enjoyed it. And so I figured I'll write another and I'm real happy doing it.
Louis, how does it make you feel that you're talking about the authors that meant so much to you, that in 20 or 30 years someone's going to say, well, I learned to read because I fell in love with a book by Louis Sachar? What do you think of that?
I think that's amazing because I know how much I admire my favorite authors. I mean, they're my heroes, and to think that some kids feel, or some people feel that way about me is really quite a compliment.
I'd like to get the story about what was going through your mind when you were choosing between being an author or being a lawyer.
Well, I was always interested, my love was always writing, but I didn't know if I'd ever make a living at it. Most writers can't. It's hard enough to get published. And so my first book was published while I was in law school. And I figured, well, at least I'll finish law school, something to fall back on.
And how was that, being in school, being a student, and having a book published? What was that? What did that feel like?
Well, I don't know that it made any difference where I was. It felt great getting a book published. It was unbelievable that my name was actually on a book with real illustrations, and it was a dream come true.
When did you make that big break? Decide to become a full-fledged children's author?
Well, I graduated law school and just kept on putting off looking for a job. And I'd write in the mornings, my 2 hours a day, and then I just would think, well, I really need to look for a job. And this went on for years. And finally, after about 4 years, it finally dawned on me, I've obviously made a decision, so quit kicking myself and worrying about it.
And it was a good decision.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So I did do part-time legal work for about 8 years.
Really?
Before my book started selling well enough that I was able to quit quit doing that.
But you don't miss it.
Not at all. Well, Lucky and Tippy are the only people allowed in my office with me when I'm writing, because they can't read. Lucky lies by the door, and if anybody tries to come in, he growls. So he seems to know that no one else is allowed in. No, I've never used them as characters. They just sit in the room with me and help me write. Come here. Come here. Come right here. No, come here. Come here. Lucky, come here. Come on. Stay. Look at the camera. This is Lucky. He's about 8 years old. We call him, Sherry, our daughter, named him Lucky because we got him at the Humane Society and she felt he was lucky to be rescued. And that's Tippy. She's about 2 years old and Sherry named her too because of the white tips on her toes. Yeah, it used to be, I told you earlier how I write for about 2 hours a day. I used to be able to write for longer than 2 hours, maybe on my fourth or fifth draft of a book. But since we got Tippy, she's gotten very used to the 2 hours, and usually after I finish writing, we come here for a walk. And so now after about 2 hours, whether I'm done or not, she starts barking at me and pawing at me and lets me know that it's time to go to the park.
What we're going to do right now is talk a little bit about your books. Who is Marvin Redpost?
Marvin's a third grader who, pretty decent kid, but just a lot of odd things happen to. Those books are pretty much written as beginning chapter books.
I'd like to talk a little bit about There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom, and I'd like you to tell me this story about Carla.
Well, I'll begin with how I started writing There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom, and that started with a true story. Lucky, excuse me. It started with a true story a friend of mine told me. He was in 5th grade at the time. I didn't know him then. And his family had moved in the middle of the school year, so he had to go to a new school. And the first thing he had to do was stand up at the front of the room. And of course, he was real nervous and scared being up at the front. The teacher asked him to tell something about himself, and he didn't know what to say. And finally, the teacher said, "Okay, Jeff, why don't you take that seat over there?" And he went to take his seat, and someone said, "Oh, don't sit there, not next to Donnie." And the teacher said, "Well, that's the only seat we have available." And Jeff was just glad to get away from the front of the room. He said, "I don't care where I sit." And then the teacher, right in front of the whole class, said, "Well, no one really likes sitting next to Donnie." And he was so surprised that a teacher would be that insensitive that he remembered it all his life and told me about it many years later. And that's how I began writing There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom. It began with a teacher saying no one likes sitting next to Bradley. I changed the name. And then I started making up things for Bradley to do to show why no one likes sitting next to him. So in the first chapter, Jeff says, "I don't mind sitting next to you," and Bradley says, "Give me $1 or I'll spit on you." So I've been working on this for a while, and I did a school visit and met a counselor at an elementary school, which I had never heard of before. I didn't have counselors at my elementary school. So I was intrigued by that idea, and so I decided to put a counselor in the book. The name of the counselor I met was Carla, and I met her at Davis Elementary School in Plano, Texas. So I named her Carla Davis in the book. And the book's about Bradley and about how Carla helps him. And during that time, Carla and I got to know each other quite well. And the book took about a year to write, and then it kept getting turned down by publishers, and I kept rewriting it. And by the time the book was actually published, Carla and I were married.
One thing that I thought was so excellent about your book, Holes, among everything was excellent about that book, to tell you the truth, but I really loved the names. Where did you come up with the names?
Well, each name I had to stop and think about, what do I want to call this character? And I had fun coming up with those names like Armpit and Squid and Zigzag. a lot of the reviews have talked about what a clever name the main character is, Stanley Yelnats. Yelnats is Stanley spelled backwards. And I never thought that was particularly clever. I was caught up in writing the story, and I didn't want to have to stop and think, what am I going to name this character? So I just wrote Stanley and then wrote Stanley backwards and figured I'd change it later. And then for a variety of reasons, I decided I'd keep that as his name, but I still didn't think it was anything brilliant.
One thing about Holes is that everything came together in the end. How do you deal with that in life when things don't come together in the end?
Things don't. Well, life's different than a book. I don't plan for everything to come together at the end of my life. The hard part about Holes, people always ask me, how did you manage to keep all those threads in your head, and how'd you tie it all up at the end? And that wasn't the hard part, because I knew how it was all going to tie up at the end. The hard part was laying those threads out for to keep it and still keep the story going without all these different parts getting in the way.
One thing that was great in Holes was all the male bonding. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, Stanley was basically a friendless kid from middle school who got picked on by kind of the middle school bullies. And then he got sent to this juvenile detention center where the kids are a lot tougher than the kids who ever picked on him at middle school. And but he manages to fit in with them. And he's surprised at that somewhat, but they just assume that anyone who's been sent to Camp Green Lake must be some tough kid, so they don't question the fact that Stanley's not. And so he's actually happy to have made friends with these kids. All right, well, Holes is the story of Stanley Yelnats, who's wrongfully convicted of a crime and sent to a juvenile correctional facility Camp Green Lake, where he's required to dig a hole every day, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide, under the brutal Texas sun. And the part I'm going to read is Stanley has finally finished digging his first hole. It has taken him all day to dig it. He's hot and tired and sweaty and can barely walk, but at least he's gotten the first hole done. And as he says, the first hole's the hardest. Well, how'd you like your first hole? Asked Squid. Stanley groaned and the other boys laughed. Well, the first hole's the hardest, said Stanley. No way, said X-Ray. Second hole's a lot harder. You're hurting before you even get started. If you think you're sore now, just wait and see how you feel tomorrow morning, right? That's right, said Squid. Plus, the fun's gone, said X-Ray. The fun? Asked Stanley. Don't lie to me, said X-Ray. I bet you always wanted to dig a big hole, right? Am I right? Stanley had never really thought about it before, but he knew better than to tell X-Ray he wasn't right. Every kid in the world wants to dig a great big hole, said X-Ray. To China, right? Right, said Stanley. See what I mean, said X-Ray. That's what I'm saying. But now the fun's gone, and you still got to do it again and again and again. Camp Fun and Games, said Stanley.
Now, I got a question for you, Louis. Does your daughter ever bring you in for show and tell?
Oh, I've been going to her classes ever since she was in kindergarten, so and it's usually been the same kids all along, so they've all heard me over and over again say the same things probably. This is my office. I come here every morning. Sometimes I may go jogging first with the dogs, and then I come here first thing in the morning and write for 2 hours every day. I write on this computer. I've got it turned to the files for Holes. Each one of these was a file for the book. Each file contains 2 or 3 chapters, except for some of these may have been ideas that never quite materialized, or they may have been final revisions, like page number 102. I probably on the final version just retyped that page, so I called it 102. I didn't always write with a computer. When I first started in 1976, my first book, Sideways Stories from Wayside School, computers hadn't been invented yet. And I used to just write it out on a typewriter, And then every time I made a revision, I had to retype the whole page. Now with the computer, I can just go back and retype a word or two. I don't know what I would do if I wasn't a writer. I imagine I'd still be writing. And maybe I'd be an unhappy lawyer. I've always liked math. I maybe would like to do something with that. Maybe teach. Some of you may be wondering what was on this pegboard, who all these kids are. I get lots of fan letters, and a lot of times kids send me pictures of themselves in the fan letters, and I'll put them up on a board. And then when I'm writing a book, sometimes when I'm trying to think of how to describe a character, I might pick out one of the pictures and describe that character as a character in the book. I don't know any of these people's names. Some of these pictures are probably pretty old. These kids might actually be about 25 years old by now.
Louis, I know in The Boy Who Lost His Face, you were had a big problem with censorship. What are your thoughts on censorship?
Well, I think it's a shame that there is so much censorship, and the problem now is not that so many books get censored, but people are so afraid that they'll get censored that they censor them themselves. So librarians think, well, I better not buy this book because someone might complain. So publishers think, well, I better not publish this book because librarians won't buy it because somebody might complain. So then authors think, well, I can't write this book because publishers won't publish it. And so the books get censored without anyone even complaining. And I think that's a loss, because I think there's a lot of issues that that kids would enjoy reading about that they don't have the opportunity to.
Do you want to tell everyone that there are no poisonous lizards in the state of Texas?
Well, I've been surprised by how many people ask me if there really are yellow-spotted lizards. And I made them up, and it just amazes me that so many people have to ask, because if you've read the book, they just fit the story too well for them to have been real. You know, they do everything I want them to do on command.
Is that okay for me to put that in?
Sure.
Okay, yeah, that's great. What was it about onions?
There's something very soulful and down-to-earth about onions. And I remember I wasn't sure if onions would grow, if it could be realistic that this onion field would exist all by itself for 100 years. So I got a book all about how to grow onions, which really didn't answer my questions. But the book, as kind of an introduction, talked about how onions had been used as medicine throughout like in ancient Egyptian times. So all the things in holes about how onions are used to cure rheumatism and baldness and good for the liver and good for the digestion, all that was stuff people used to believe, and maybe even some truth to it. I don't know.
Louis, what I would love for you to do is to sign my book of holes.
Okay.
I've been carrying it around all day.
Hope the dogs didn't get it too muddy.
Not too muddy.